Thanks, Lisa. It's great to be joining you today. I actually am CEO and founder of United States Connect. It's a new online one-stop shop for companies looking at going to the States. So we've brought together about 50,000 words of content, everything that you need to know about going to the States, and also rated service providers. So accountants, lawyers, logistics have actually been rated by other exporters, so you know that they'll do a good job and that other companies have used them. A little bit about my history as it relates to the Free Trade Agreement. I actually originally went to the States to roll out the Australian government strategy around the Free Trade Agreement back in 2004, and we actually put additional resources in the market when I was with Austrade, and we looked at all the segments that were going to benefit. So back at that time, I was sort of at the coalface of all the tariff reductions and all those sorts of things. In terms of, if we just go to the next slide, Lisa. In terms of the US market, we know it's still the world's largest market. Population of 318 million people, GDP per capita of 45,000, and more importantly, a GDP growth of 3.5%. So it really is coming back with a vengeance. It's still the largest consumer market in the world with $4.5 trillion. And also, it's the key investment hub. So we all know that a lot of Australian companies go to the States to get Series A, Series B funding, and you can see why with total VC investments hitting nearly $30 billion in 2013. It is a consumer-driven market with consumer spending making up about 70% of GDP, and the point I'm raising there is that the economic recovery is real now. We've been talking about the US coming out of recession for some time, but I think we can safely say that it has now. 2.6 million new jobs were created in the last year, and unemployment's now below Australia's unemployment rate, which was steady today but is still above 6%. The US has now dropped below 6%. And interestingly, manufacturing production is actually growing at quite a steady clip, and that's got a lot to do with obviously new companies and new sectors, but also onshoring. So there's a lot of onshoring happening where US companies are taking their manufacturing, which they offshored to China and other markets, and bringing it back onshore. Good example of this is automotive, where we're actually back up to an 8-year high in terms of auto sales in September. I'm not going to spend too much time on some of the hot sectors, but you'll be able to access the presentation afterwards. But some as they relate to the Free Trade Agreement. Health is a large growing area at the moment, largely due to the ageing population, but also the healthcare reform bill. And the US has 40% of the global share of the health market, the medical device market. Clean technology has also been a focus for the Obama administration. An investment in clean tech from the private sector has accounted for about $55.9 billion in the last year. And you can actually see that coming through with nearly 40% of all new domestic power capacity installed in 2013 being from renewable sources. ICT obviously is a large and growing area, and this is where a lot of the VC funds are going towards. But also, interestingly, 55% of the global ICT R&D comes out of the States. And agribusiness and food, which I'll talk about shortly, is one of the areas that really benefit from the Free Trade Agreement, and is a growing area due to the focus on biofuels, but also the Obama administration's focus on expanding its FTAs with other countries around the world, and also genetically modified foods. So productivity in the agribusiness segment is growing rapidly, but they're also looking for new technologies from around the world to increase that productivity. Now, if we turn to the United States, Australia-United States Free Trade Agreement, bilateral trade has actually grown by 38% since it came into force. Now, that can be a whole range of reasons, but that's actually not a bad effort considering, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, the Australian dollar's been working against us. A lot of the benefits out of the Free Trade Agreement aren't immediately obvious, but as someone who's worked in the States for over 10 years, I think Australian companies, it gives them greater certainty, and more importantly, it gives their customers greater certainty when dealing with Australian companies. And it also gives Australian companies something to hang their hat on. We were the first developed country to have a free trade agreement in this region, and it certainly gives us more credibility when we go to do those large deals in the States. In terms of some of the key outcomes, 2/3 of ag tariffs were immediately reduced, and full implementation will come in 2022. Duties on 97% of US non-ag tariff lines were duty-free from day one, and the remainder of those goods, importantly, will be duty-free from the 1st of January next year, which marks the 10th anniversary of the agreement. In terms of services, it gives our service companies greater access in areas like professional services, business services, education, environmental, financial and transport. And also one of the major outcomes was access to the US federal government procurement market and that of 31 states in the US. And I'll let Patrick talk more about that. In a minute, you can see there that the government procurement market is massive. It's worth $517 billion. And as I said, Patrick will go into more detail on where we've benefited from in the government procurement market, but also some of the tricks and traps that companies have learnt over the years in terms of accessing government contracts, and also talk about some of the companies that have benefited and have made sales in the States. So I'll leave that to Patrick. In terms of manufacturers, auto parts had an immediate elimination of tariffs, and tariffs on textiles, some footwear and a handful of other items were to be phased out over time. And the good news is that from the 1st of January 2015, most manufactured products out of Australia will be duty-free going into the States. In terms of agribusiness and food, our beef quota has been substantially increased already, and it will grow 18.5% over the first 18 years of the agreement. Sheep and lamb is now duty-free going into the US since 2008. We've got guaranteed annual quota increases for dairy, and that's led to quite a significant increase in particularly of artisan cheeses, but also some of the bulk cheeses coming out of some of our major dairy companies. Horticulture products have gained access. Things like avocados and mangoes, which weren't allowed in previously, are either in the process of being allowed or have zero tariff. Cereals, processed foods, and also a large market in the States for Australian companies is wine, and those tariffs will reduce to zero from the 1st of January 2015. And all of our seafood was duty-free from day one of the agreement. As I said, our services businesses have also benefited. There's actually a framework now for mutual recognition of qualifications, and there are some states where those qualifications are recognised, and that's increasing all the time. There's also a framework for cooperation on financial services. So what that actually means is the Department of Foreign Affairs and their counterparts in the States get together on an annual basis and work through some of the impediments, some of the barriers to services in the States. In terms of intellectual property, which is very important for our creative industries, we've actually got laws in place now that have been harmonised with those of the States to make it a more certain legal environment in terms of IP, and also in terms of copyright. There's a greater protection and an agreed legal process if people want to pursue between those two countries. I've just listed here some really useful resources. Obviously you'll get an opportunity later today to ask questions of the panellists, but if you are looking for further information on the Free Trade Agreement, there is quite a lot more information on the DFAT website, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade website. If you want to look up tariffs, you can go into the US International Trade Commission. They actually have a searchable database, and if you go in and search if you have your harmonised tariff code, you can go in and search there, and it will tell you if there's a preferential rate on your product for the Australia-United States Free Trade Agreement. If you don't know what the classification is of your product in the States, you can actually seek a binding ruling from US Customs, and that's actually an online process now, and we've just been through that process with one of our clients who got a good ruling and has allowed them to get around some of the dumping provisions that some of their products coming in from China have to adhere to. In terms of rules of origin, again, Patrick's going to go into a little bit more detail there about what that means. It doesn't, if you get some components of your product manufactured overseas, doesn't necessarily discount you from accessing the benefits under the Free Trade Agreement. Some people don't realise that, and you need to be aware of that and make sure you're across the rules of origin. And FedBiz Ops is actually an entry point for all government procurement opportunities in the States, and if you're interested in those, I'd recommend you going to it. And I mentioned our website before. We've been up and running for about 2.5 months and received a fantastic response. There's actually checklists on the website that take you through everything that you need to do to go to the States, from logistics to banking to legal and everything in between. And then, as I said, there's rated service providers that can assist you in the States. So that's all I've got to talk about today. Welcome any questions that you have. We want to keep this session nice, short and sweet, so that you do have the opportunity to ask questions. And I'll now hand back to Lisa, and look forward to hearing from Patrick.
Thank you very much, Ian. So I'm very pleased now to welcome Patrick Fazzone, who's over in the United States, as I earlier alluded to, and he's going to drive the second part of our webinar. Now, Patrick is a partner at Washington, D.C.-based firm, as I previously alluded to. They offer clients the full range of legal services, from international trade and business to intellectual property protection, commercial and tax law, to litigation and employment and immigration law. He has been involved in matters involving Australia and Australia trade and investment for over 25 years. So he really is an expert on this topic, and I'm very pleased that he will be presenting for us today. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I appreciate it. And if you'd be able to go to the first slide, I think that'd be excellent. You know, I think it's a great time to be thinking about the Australia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and its 10th anniversary year, in part because there's been a lot of focus on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is also under negotiation right now between the United States, Australia, and 10 other countries. But it's timely to go back and review the benefits of the Australia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, in large part because the TPP is not likely to improve on much of what was negotiated in the Australia Free Trade Agreement. So this agreement continues to be extremely relevant, as Ian noted, and it's a great time to go back and I think take a look at it. Many of the benefits of the Free Trade Agreement are well understood or taken for granted, and as Ian alluded, you can go to the harmonized tariff schedules of the United States and see all the items that are zero duty if entered from Australia. The agreement's comprehensive, and it creates all sorts of great opportunities. But there are other benefits too that are sometimes less well recognized. I think you really need to delve into the agreement and study its chapters a little more carefully to understand and appreciate how it might actually benefit your country. I want to give a couple of examples, given the shortness of time, just talk about a few examples of where there are some benefits, and then move on to a couple of illustrations in the government procurement area. One is the rules of origin. Ian made reference to the rules of origin, and essentially every trade agreement has them, and what they mean is if you you can benefit from the free trade agreement and qualify your product as having origin, for example, in Australia, even if you incorporate third country content into the product. So that's a very interesting idea that we'll come back to in a second, but it really enlarges and expands the benefits of the agreement. Another potential benefit that often folks don't think about is this free trade agreement allows you to take advantage of other free trade agreements to which the United States is a signatory. And as an example, you could set up a facility in the United States to produce goods that could qualify for preferential entry into a whole range of other countries with which the United States has free trade agreements. And you can incorporate Australian content into those goods and still qualify as goods produced in the United States. That can expand your export opportunities, and you can do that on your own or in partnership with an Australian company or a U.S. company. Let me just hone in then on, I call them 3 examples of strategies for Australian companies to benefit from the Australia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Lisa, if we could just turn the slide to the next one. The first example, again, is using rules of origin to benefit from duty-free entry. Under the Australia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, there is duty-free entry for most Australian exports to the United States, as Ian indicated. And exports qualify for this preferential duty treatment if they meet applicable rules of origin in the agreement. So if your good is produced entirely in Australia, it certainly qualifies as Australian origin, or a mining or agricultural product mined or grown in Australia is Australian content. But of course, Australian origin, but of course, it's not limited there. As I mentioned earlier, other goods can qualify as well as long as they meet certain specific criteria set up in the agreement. And those rules of origin typically require a certain percentage of local Australian content and a change in tariff classification from any imported components to the final exported product. But if those criteria are met, the product is considered Australian origin and it's eligible for the preferential duty rate into the United States. A real-life example from a client of ours, a machine tool produced in Australia had certain electrical and other components produced in China and Japan, but it still qualified for duty-free entry into the U.S. because of the value of the third country components was less than the requisite level, and because there was a required change in tariff classification. In other words, maybe you shouldn't automatically assume that a product made in should be made in a factory in China and then shipped direct to the United States if you want to do business in the U.S. You might also consider the feasibility of producing the product in Australia with components from China or other low-cost points of origin and then shipping that product from Australia to the U.S. Doing your sums, you might find that the duty saving could offset any additional costs of assembling and shipping from Australia. A second area, and Lisa, if I could have the next slide, a second example really of benefits that are not always appreciated are in the area of services, exports, and business mobility. As Ian pointed out, there have been provided for under the agreement steps to facilitate exports of a whole range of Australian services, including professional services in the United States. And in various states, Australian accreditation is sufficient to be able to render services such as engineering, architectural, legal, and accounting services. But it's worth mentioning something else, and that is that the Australia Free Trade Agreement also set the stage for legislation in the United States creating a unique class of visa for Australians only called the E3 visa. I think word's gotten out about the benefits of this visa class, but it's really worth pointing out its potential benefit to exporters as well. This visa is available for certain persons with the right types of credentials in so-called specialty occupations. So you have to have a job offer in the United States, you have to have a tertiary or higher or degree or 12 years equivalent business experience, and you have to be going to take a position requiring this background. But the E3 visa is a great way to help business build your U.S. export business by allowing a company to station its sales, marketing, or other support staff in the U.S., typically through the establishment of a U.S. entity for that purpose. Third example, and it's the subject I'll elaborate on just a little bit further in a little bit more detail, is the government procurement area, and that's sales to U.S. federal and state governments. Next slide, Lisa, if you can. The government procurement chapter in the agreement is one of the most potentially useful outcomes of the Australia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement for Australian companies. It affords access to a variety of federal and state procurement contracts that may not have been open to Australian suppliers before. There are really two tangible benefits. One, Australia is now so-called designated country, which allows Australian suppliers to contract directly with the federal government in a lot of areas. And there's also a waiver of something called the Buy American Act, which otherwise imposes a price penalty on bidders who are not from qualifying countries. So suddenly, Australian suppliers, as a direct result of this government procurement chapter, have become potentially much more price competitive, both for goods, services, and also construction services in U.S. contracts. Also, the agreement helps create a far more congenial environment, hospitable environment for Australian contractors in the United States with the federal government, including guaranteed non-discriminatory treatment and transparency in the bidding process. On the state level, as Ian pointed out, 31 states have agreed to apply these general principles to their procurement processes as well, and the agreement has opened up a variety of new opportunities to Australian companies. Since we're talking about the government procurement chapter, the chapter opened up the opportunity to sell to the U.S. federal and state governments. I think it's worth spending just a couple of minutes on the challenges and opportunities in doing business with the federal and state governments. And I wanted to focus really on sales to the U.S. federal government. There are a couple of points I think you always need to bear in mind. Unlike in Australia, where the procurement rules are so-called principle-based rules, in U.S. federal government, the system is completely different. It's based on a very complex web of regulatory provisions and legal statutory provisions that dictate supplier conduct at a whole range of levels. So sales to the U.S. federal government are completely different from commercial sales, and this reflects in large part the purchasing power of the U.S. federal government. So suppliers have to agree to a whole range of requirements and obligations imposed by the buyer, both in the supply contract, under federal law, and also in these U.S. government procurement regulations. Those regulations are known as the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR, and in addition, individual departments, government departments also have their own supplements to the FAR. And these various requirements dictate all sorts of things, required business practices of the contractor, formulas for determining pricing, restriction on pricing, detailed cost criteria, and a range of other obligations. The regulations also have very specialized provisions on the treatment and ownership of intellectual property. So a supplier to the U.S. federal government really needs to study and carefully consider these regulations prior to entering into any sort of contract or even a subcontract on a federal government process. This whole process of trying to adhere to these contracting requirements and submitting a responsive and compliant bid is complex, and it involves, in my experience, a large amount of advanced preparation on the part of intending bidders. We really have to emphasize that in this system there is absolutely no tolerance for bids that fail to meet the detailed requirements set forth in the RFP and in the FAR and other statutory and regulatory provisions. One other thing worth mentioning, in selling to this sophisticated customer, there are different strategies as well for trying to sell to the federal government. These include offering a good or service as a sole source product, which means no competitive bidding, trying to offer your good or service as an off-the-shelf item, which makes procurement really easy for a contracting officer, trying to qualify for small business set-aside contracts, which are guaranteed set-asides, a certain percentage of a contract, seeking U.S. government R&D funding for a project or technology, not trying to sell directly, but selling via a prime contractor as a subcontractor, or perhaps even licensing your technology to the government rather than selling a product to the government that done by a prime contractor. So because of the complexity of the U.S. federal acquisition system, many non-U.S. companies do seek to act as a subcontractor to a prime on a federal contract. It can be a very good strategy, but you still need to understand the procurement system and be able to make the case for your goods, service, or technology. You really need to understand in that scenario the potential risks of contracting through a prime. Be aware of the fact that the federal procurements often contain flow-down provisions that run to the contractors and apply to the subcontractors' performance as well. Just finally, a few examples of Australian companies that are contracted with the U.S. federal government for procurement contracts, and these are all since the Australia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Major contract that Air Services Australia had with the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration to handle air traffic control in 5 airports, U.S. airports in the Asia-Pacific region. ASA was able to get that contract because it demonstrated its technical capability and ability to provide the service competitively, but it took a fair bit of startup education to get in the position to be able to compete competitively, and ASA did do that as a prime contractor. Another organization, a research organization in Australia, developed some very sophisticated research into technologies relevant to surveillance, and was able to contract with a department administration within the Department of Defense for the development of a desired surveillance capability, something that DoD was seeking to develop. Another company that we've worked with has a leading speech and language recognition capability. It's been awarded various government contracts because of this expertise. Again, it's been able to develop the sophistication to contract or subcontract, and it also now does a lot of that through its U.S.-based subsidiary. Another company we've dealt with is a leading Australian provider of emergency medical services, and it's entered into various contracts to provide these services. It's used various different strategies, including qualifying for Department of Defense classified contracts, which is a fairly involved process, but doable. Contracting through a small business set-aside company, and also seeking to sole source contract with the U.S. government. And a very well-known example in the United States as well is Austal Ships, which is based in WA, and it's becoming a major supplier of catamaran ships to the U.S. Navy via its U.S. subsidiary, which is located in Mobile, Alabama. So I think, really, by way of lessons learned, the Free Trade Agreement has opened up a whole range of new business opportunities, including and maybe and especially in government procurement. But that was only the beginning. Australian companies, to take advantage of these opportunities, still need to take the time and effort to understand the complexity and sophistication of the federal and state procurement systems in the United States. Even if your product, service, and technology might be attractive to a U.S. government agency or to a prime contractor, there's no substitute for careful advanced preparation in this area. And that concludes my comments.
Thank you, Patrick. And I'm actually going to throw it back to you because Bruce is unable to join us, and we were going to talk through the benefits that their company have received through government procurement, and I just wondered if you could just briefly touch on that so that we could get a bit more in-depth information about how an Australian company has benefited.
Yeah, I'd be happy to provide that case study since I've been involved throughout the process. But the Australian Nuclear Science Technology Organization, I think is well known to all of us. But what a lot of us don't understand is that it has developed nuclear technology capabilities that have application outside of its own business purposes in Lucas Heights. And two of the things that its capabilities it's developed is in nuclear medicine and in nuclear cleanup technology. And it's the latter opportunity, the nuclear cleanup technology, that we've been working on in the United States now for quite some time, but it's been a very interesting process. As a result of the Australia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, procurements by the Department of Energy are now open to Australian companies. It's not that we were thinking about the Free Trade Agreement front and center when ANSTO decided to pursue the opportunities that it was aware of, but it has gone ahead and positioned itself to provide a technology for the cleanup of a certain type of nuclear waste in connection with a cleanup that is occurring in Idaho, the state of Idaho, at a former U.S. government nuclear facility. So the company has had to do, it's a statutory corporation, but the entity has had to do a whole range of positioning and strategizing to be able to position itself for these opportunities. The Department of Energy is now reletting the contract, and ANSTO is looking at it very carefully at the moment. But ANSTO has had to develop a in-depth understanding of the very complex Department of Energy procurement rules. It's also had to try to develop a strategy for taking advantage of the opportunity in a way that's consistent with its own resources. ANSTO does not view itself in this type of opportunity as a service provider, so it's not going to be sending a whole bunch of technicians over to the United States, but rather it does have a technology and a know-how for cleaning up this particular type of nuclear waste. So we're looking right now at the possibility of licensing that technology to the prime prime contractor, which would then be performing the cleanup or designing a cleanup facility and then performing cleanup in due course for the Department of Energy. So I think there are a couple of different lessons to be learned from ANSTO's experience. One is the importance of understanding the procurement environment. Number two is the importance of considering various different strategies for bringing your goods, service, or technology to the U.S. government. And one thing I'm not really haven't gone into in any detail, but there are plenty of pitfalls that we've had to deal with over time. And but I think, you know, a lot of good lessons learned, and ANSTO, as the developer of a leading technology, I think is really in a position to provide a real value add here to this this cleanup project.
Thank you very much for that, Patrick. So we're now going to just move into to questions, and I do ask you, if you have some specific questions for either of our panelists, to please email them into the panel on the right hand side. Someone was very eager to get a question in that they emailed me in advance of today's webinar. One of our attendees have not had any problems when exporting goods under the 2,500 Australian US Free Trade Agreement, i.e. small consignments set by FedEx or UPS, but they do have a current situation with their shipping company where US Customs and Border Security will charge a minimum of $50 US in terms of duty exemption surcharge under the agreement. Also, entry fees will be payable. When they look up both agreements, it states no duty and no process fees. So I just wondered, Patrick or Ian, if you wanted to address this question.
Yeah, I'll go first, Patrick. It's not something I can answer immediately, but there are mechanisms in place to pursue this sort of thing. The first thing I'd say is the company's done exactly the right thing and making sure that they are getting the tariff reduction. And I'd say that to everyone. Don't just assume that your freight forwarder knows about this. Make sure that they're checking that you are getting the tariff reduction. I was speaking to Patrick before, and we don't believe that there were any exemptions from any processing fees at the other end, that is with US Customs. But we will pursue this and see if we can get an answer for the company in relation to processing fees around the Free Trade Agreement. And the nice thing is that the Department of Foreign Affairs constantly consults with their colleagues in the States on issues like this. and if it does become a major issue and a major impediment to trade, then that's something they will raise. So we will take that question offline if that's okay, and we'll be in contact with the company directly to answer that.
Thank you, Ian. And Patrick, did you want to add anything further to that?
Well, I wanted to just underscore what Ian was said about the importance of not just flicking off the decision about what the proper customs classification is to a freight forwarder or someone else. We have a client from Australia right now that's facing a $25,000 penalty for a misclassification, which customs can do if you've misclassified. And in that instance, we're trying to make the case to customs that, in fact, we did exercise reasonable care in classifying the goods. If you flick the decision off to someone else and they make a mistake, you're still liable.
That's a very good point. I've had a question that's just come in. Is there an online resource for locating individual U.S. government Buy American and FAR requirements?
Yes, well, there certainly is, in that you can Google the foreign acquisition regulation. You can also Google any of the supplements, and you'll find all sorts of publicly available information, including the actual text of the regulations. You have to bear in mind that the regulations are over 2,000 pages long, so it's no doubt the most complex set of procurement laws and regulations anywhere in the world. Trying to make sense of it without consulting an expert is, in my experience, fraught with peril. So I think it's good to take a look, good to try to have answer your own questions online, try to get a feel for what the environment is, what the rules might be, and then double check with somebody who understands how the regulations work.
That's a very good point. Now, a specific question here for Ian. Does the waiver to the Buy American Act only apply to federal contracts, or does it extend to other state governments or funded construction projects?
And I'm going to shoot that one to Patrick again, because he's the expert on federal government procurement and state government procurement. Patrick, did you get that question?
I did, yeah, thanks. Yeah, the waiver for the from the Buy American provision applies only to federal government procurements, since it's a federal act applicable only to federal government procurements. A couple of other important things to bear in mind, and unfortunately the Australian government actually discovered this after the conclusion of the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement in 2004. The waiver does not apply to other legislation that still exists that gives preferential treatment status to domestic supply, including one law called the Buy America Act, which applies to Department of Transportation contracts. So there are limitations to the waiver. One is that it only applies to federal government procurements, and the other is that it doesn't apply to all situations. However, it applies to a substantial portion of them, and it's created a much more open environment for Australian suppliers.
Thanks, Patrick. Another question we've had through actually relating to the Export Market Development Grant, or EMDG as it's also known. Does the EMDG still allow for setting up a US office and or staff? Ian, you might want to answer that.
Yeah, again, I'm not an EMDG expert, but I do know, and I was actually talking to a client yesterday who was looking to set up an office in the States, and I said that you should be talking to an EMDG consultant before you do that, because there are ways of setting up an operation in the States which you may be able to claim. So what you can claim is not sales reps as such, but people that are doing business development and marketing for you. So there may be a way of setting up a business that will allow you to claim that from the EMDG scheme, the Export Market Development Grant Scheme. But if that person would like to shoot me an email afterwards, again, I can follow that up for you.
I think the Export Council would also like to just add in here that your best bet when in looking at this is, one, is to look at asking a consultant to make sure that if you are looking to claim under EMDG, you have followed the guidelines in terms of being able to claim for that from the very get-go. The other is to just make sure that people are aware that there is a limit on the number of grants that exporters can claim for the United States. So to be aware of that as well, and just make sure that that's factored into the total number of grants you might be looking at applying for.
And another thing we've encountered just recently is don't jump in the first year. If you've just started exporting and you've spent, you know, your 10 grand and you think you should go and get EMDG, you might be better waiting for a couple of years when you're spending 30 or 40 and you can claim a lot more and you can actually put 2 years together. So just keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, I'd recommend that as well. Yeah. Okay, we've this is always a tricky question to answer, and we'll show there's an easier way to do it. If you've got a unique product, how is the best way to find out how you should classify your product as with a harmonized tariff code? I think a lot of companies rely on their freight forwarders to do this for them, which is often actually where the problems exist. Should I throw that to you, Patrick, and Ian, you might want to comment on that?
I can actually, I've got a case study, Patrick, if you like.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so we actually had a company not long ago that was sending steel products into the States, and they were actually moorings and other boat products, and they were getting caught with basically a dumping duty. So we actually went to US Customs and got them a finding from US Customs. So like I said during the presentation, you can actually go to US Customs and actually have an individual finding done for your particular product. It is a bit of a process, but there is an online process now. And again, if that particular person wants to email me, I can send through the link and all the information they need on that and how they go about it. But that's definitely the way the thing to do, because as Patrick said, if you misclassify, it's not US Customs' fault, it's actually your fault. And a lot of the laws, as Patrick will tell you, in the US come back to you as the manufacturer wherever you manufacture.
And I would like to just add, don't rely always just on your customs broker or freight forwarder making the assumption they're classifying you correctly.
Yeah, yeah. And what that's called, what I just outlined, is a binding ruling. So that obviously is coming from US Customs, and that can't be questioned. So as Lisa said, don't just rely on your freight forwarder, you know, to be coming up with the right classification, and also check with them that they're making sure that you're being exempt from the tariffs that you are eligible for under the free trade agreement.
Yeah.
You know, and I really want to underscore both of those comments, because this is an area, it's a bit of a minefield. It's a little bit like dealing with the United States Internal Revenue Service on tax issues. Everything seems very benign until something goes wrong. And then you discover all the parade of horribles, the penalties, all that kind of stuff that can be easily avoided with some precaution in advance and some due care. So I think that's exactly right. If after investigating it, taking a look at it, you're still not sure, then go for the binding ruling. It takes a little time and expense up front, but it's well worth it.
Thanks, Patrick. Now, I guess this is less free trade agreement related, but it really does relate to recognitions of standards in different countries. But we've had a question about registering medical devices where they've been registered in Australia, but obviously that does not mean that there is an automatic recognition of that in the United States under the FTA. Do you want to talk about that, Patrick?
Well, yeah. Absolutely. There are some things that are transferable, but if something has to be registered with the FDA, a medical device in the United States, and the registration has to be pursued by the exporter or whomever is going to be responsible. And that has to be done. You can't just rely on an Australian registration if it is registrable in the United States.
I'll just add to that, there are consultants that can help with that, obviously. We do have some listed on United States Connect, and they've been working with Australian companies for about 10 years on those regulations. So again, if you want to shoot me an email, happy to take that question offline.
And I think we've had a couple of companies where this process can be quite complicated, that it is worth making sure that you are engaging someone in the United States to assist with that process. Yeah, as the systems are very different between Australia and America. Okay, another question, expanding on the Australian-US Free Trade Agreement, and we've said it's been enforced for 10 years now. Is there any mechanism to review or extend the FTA? If yes, how can businesses be involved in the process?
I'd be happy to answer that, or at least give you my thoughts on that. The agreement doesn't have any end date, and so the agreement just continues in effect. And so there's no need to worry about trying to extend it. There are potentially opportunities to revisit it. One opportunity was in the context of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, where I'm quite certain that Foreign Affairs and Trade put some things on the table to reopen with the United States, and I think in some instances at least the United States was rather resistant in reopening certain concessions, but particularly in agribusiness. But it's certainly conceivable that at the conclusion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership process, if there were still areas that were unaddressed, you could ask Foreign Affairs and Trade in the context of some of the ongoing framework to revisit issues, potentially, for example, in some of the working groups. I don't know how much prospect there is realistically to get bilateral negotiations between Australia and the U.S. to recommence anytime soon for anything that would need to be negotiated as part of the formal process, though.
But that's a good point, Patrick. That's what the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is there for. So there are annual consultations between the two governments. If you're having issues or you see barriers to you doing trade with the states, that's something you should raise with them. And if it's significant enough, they will take that forward. But again, I think we can take that offline and send I think there's an email where you can send your particular issue to, and we can provide that to you.
That, and obviously the Export Council of Australia as a peak body represents small to medium exporters. So we are always very open to people either calling us or emailing us through any potential barriers that they have experienced or problems. We regularly consult on your behalf to DFAT, and we don't know what's happening unless you tell us. So we do encourage you to contact us, and we're very happy to be able to either respond to you or follow up or chase, but also to put it on record for our consultation back. Someone has very rightly pointed out in response to the earlier question on the export market development grant, that obviously companies can also look at state governments for smaller grant programs, particularly on export development and market access, and obviously the New South Wales government, who is our partner in this event, is a good starting point, particularly with their what they're doing in their export capability building program at the moment. Now, so I do also ask you to look at that. I'm just pulling up if we've got any more final questions, but I think we probably have reached the end of most of your questions for today. I would just like to thank Patrick and Ian for joining me today for this webinar. We are running a series of these. We're trying to squeeze them all in before the end of the year, and you can see an outline of the upcoming events that the Export Council is running in conjunction with New South Wales Trade and Investment as part of their export capability building program. There is a link there too, also to other activity that they're running, and we encourage you to get involved. There's been several questions that require some follow-up, so what we will do is I will send you around both Patrick and Ian's contact details as well as a copy of this presentation, and once we get the link up you'll be able to review this again in your own time. So on behalf of New South Wales Trade and Investment and the Export Council of Australia, as well as Ian Smith and Patrick, I thank you for joining us today. I wish you a good afternoon, and hopefully we'll join you online at one of our other webinars that are coming up in the next couple of weeks. Thank you.